Welcome to the session on how to reimagine or how to revision governance. And to a certain extent, having been here since the first session, this is going to be a session that builds upon the previous ones, no matter which one you were. Because we also have good news and bad news. And as Louise said, there is good news and bad news, and I'm going to start with the bad news, which is that obviously, as we already heard, we have a governance system that is based upon 20th century or even earlier kind of models of solving problems, and that as a result, we are in an environment where governance basically has a huge amount of deficits. On the one hand, we have a deficit with regard to the effectiveness of governance, meaning the fact that we discuss all the problems today, whether it's in energy, whether it's in the economy, or whether it's in healthcare, to a large extent is a failure of how we solve problems, and a failure of bringing resources together to make a real impact. But we also have a legitimacy deficit. Many people do not trust the way we govern anymore, and it's at an all-time low these days. And a result of that is because people don't see the system as accountable or reflective of how society is. And we also have a third deficit, and I think that third deficit inspired me, especially because we are at the Bloom Creative Leadership Summit, is that we also have a deficit of creativity. Meaning we really need more creativity in how we solve problems, and we don't see that at the moment within the existing governance system. So that's the bad news, and we can all become very pessimistic about that, but we also have good news, and we already heard this morning that there are a few positive developments in society, which are mainly related with the advances that we see in technology and the advances that we see in science, which brings us new ways of actually doing things, new ways that are more creative, that also are quite often more effective, and can also deal with the legitimacy deficit that we've seen in the current governance regime. And this panel is going to look at it from more the positive side and look at how can you actually leverage the advances that we currently have in science, in technology, to reimagine or revision a governance system that is effective, legitimate, and to stay in sync with the summit is also creative. And we have a great panel for reflecting on that question. And I'm going to start with introducing Jeff Friedberg very briefly. You all have the extended bios in the documentation. But Jeff Friedberg has like the most cool title, being the Chief Trust Architect. I think it must make your family pretty happy probably to be the Chief Trust Architect of Microsoft. Then we have John Clippinger, who is at MIT Media Lab. Always comes up with new acronyms that he represents somehow. So the latest one is ID3, and I see Sandy there as well, who joins the acronym dance, and at MIT Media Lab. And then we have Carlos Domingos, who I think deserves an award probably for this Creative Summit to be on the most panels as any other person. I think he's going to be on 3 panels, of which he just finished one, but is of course a chief vice or a senior vice president at Cisco, but also quite often more and better known as the technoist or nowist. Is that the nowist? Which is a new term that really captures what Carlos is. In a few moments, we're going to also be joined by Beth Novak, who somehow got stuck in 42nd Street. I think there is something called the UN General Assembly happening at the moment, and we'll be here in a moment. But let me start with perhaps John. So I said briefly the stage that there is good news, bad news with regard to governance. How do you believe we can actually change how we solve problems, and how will we do it?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I'm an optimist regarding new ways of thinking about governance. I'm not so optimistic about governments per se. And I'd like to elaborate on an acronym of ID cubed. It's Institute for Data-Driven Design. And part of the thinking that we're going through both at MIT, and I was previously at Harvard for 10 years and doing something called the Law Lab, is how do you combine technology with law and governance? And how do you look at governance as something that might be a new kind of technology? That we're moving into looking at social technologies. We're getting deeper understanding of actually how people act socially. And as a result, our science is getting much better in how to design new kinds of institutions. So it's going from something that's very ad hoc that has not changed, that I think there's a real opportunity to start to do experiments in mechanisms of governance, and over time evolve a technology of governance and be radically transformative that way. And to illustrate that, and Jeffrey and I have been involved in this whole area of how to use share personal data and at the same time protect it, and particularly as we're becoming more and more data is collected about ourselves. We're moving into living in a world of data, and there's a real fear of living in a surveillance state because you're capturing it, you're using it to make predictions. So there's a real institutional challenge how well we do that. Because we're building through the technology new kinds of social institutions, political institutions, and we have to be thoughtful about that, or we're going to find ourselves very much as sort of captive to a techno-dystopic society. And to that end, I think we can, and what things that we're working at primarily at MIT and other places through IDCube and the various partners, is how to run experiments in new models of governance and self-governance. And what is that? So moving it away from an ideological sphere to a question of, say, you want to achieve certain objectives. And I think part of that comes with legitimacy. It's like, here's an institution that performs to a standard, is transparent, it can change itself. So there are a lot of ways of thinking about regulation in a very different way. Because the whole process by which rules are made, and the statutory process, the whole lobbying process, the regulatory process, the turnaround cycles are just too short. And the expertise is not there. So you're really going to think about, can we solve this in a new way? Can we write rule sets that are self-executing and self-healing in the sense that enforce certain sets of rules? And then if they don't work, we'll change them again and make it consensual. And can we scale that? So these are the kind of things that we're doing both at IDCube and MIT with various partners around the sharing of personal data, location data, giving people their own personal data store, protecting that, encrypting that, sharing it, having it reflect different permissions, and do experiments in how you can have people govern, or have it a set of algorithms govern a whole set of relationships. And we can go into that in more detail later.
Yeah, great. Carlos, you've been, as the tech nowist, been focusing on how new technologies are disruptive to a certain extent to existing systems, both within business and elsewhere. So how do you see that within the governance field play out?
You know, it's a really interesting, and John, it's always fascinating to visit you and Sandy up at the Media Labs. These folks are really playing with a lot of the cutting edge stuff. You know, there's a cycle, I think, before we change governance. I think we need to begin with awareness. I think the largest populations that I deal with, most of them are not really aware of what's available. So, you know, if you think about it, we're experiencing a phenomenal amount of disruption in every aspect of our lives with technologies like the internet, mobile technology, and social media. And all of those three technologies are less than a quarter of a century, right? You know, we're dealing with things that are just a nanosecond in the history of mankind, yet they're so powerful and really disruptive. And really what they're all leading to is that we're living in a world that we're connected in ways that we could never dream possible. Most of us have grown up in a world where it's local, right? The majority of mankind, you were born, lived, and died within a 30-mile radius, right? And news and things that happen thousands of miles away, you would never even know about, and it wouldn't affect you in any sort of way. Now, regardless of what happens anywhere in the world, within seconds we have it on our device, and we're aware of it, and we're fully connected. So part of it is really just understanding the awareness of what's happening, how it's changing, how it's evolving, and what impact is it having on social structures. The second thing is to be inspired to imagine the possibilities. Part of this panel is really say, well, what do we do with governance? Well, what is possible in this new hyper-connected world? What can we do in the fact that we're all so connected? And what can you leverage? What problems can you solve? How can you govern better? How can we become more efficient as a result of these things. And then the third one, which is the hardest one, because I think a lot of those ideas that I just mentioned are well known, well documented, people are experimenting with it. The real challenge is how do you build adaptability and change into our culture when we as humans hate change so much, right? You know, I heard an interesting fact that after a severe heart attack, only 1 in 5 actually change the way they eat, they exercise regularly, stop smoking. So 4 out of 5 people won't change when their life depends on it. So, you know, you're introducing technology into this world, and we're saying we want to use it for governance, yet, you know, the majority of us don't. So, you know, my point is if we follow it through awareness, inspiration, and then this notion of adaptability, we can lead to a point where I think a lot of the technologies that are available is going to change how we govern and hopefully make us much more efficient, which I know we're going to get into in a moment.
Great, thank you. So, 2 positive sides. And Jeff, are you as positive as your colleagues here?
Well, I like technology, and I think there's so much that one could do with it. I think before, though, you go down that path, it's helpful to set some tenets about new technologies in this particular space. So, for example, it'd be nice if we could have had a common agreement that maybe we should be able to meet our societal goals without giving up privacy. That's kind of one of the yin-yangs there, enabling free speech, having a vote, getting services that you're entitled to. And it'd be great if that technology actually instilled confidence and increased somehow the trustworthiness of the overall system. And I think we're currently all experiencing with the NSA issue a huge potential erosion in those areas. But along those themes are enhancing transparency and accountability, but also treating citizens with respect. I think that's something that I think we'd all enjoy. Now, I expected my colleagues have already enumerated a whole slew of ways that you could potentially have or shift around the way we do governance. And I know Beth would certainly have enumerated them if she was here, but one of them is open data. And this is the idea of simply data that the government has somehow being presented to the public so it can be consumed in some meaningful way. I'll kind of take the flip of that, which is, okay, if you're going to do that, is there anything we need to be careful about? And so one of the things I'm worried about is that, as a privacy person, the more data that you end up publishing, the more likelihood that you'll start to see patterns that actually identify people. So even though data might look public and that it's sort of de-identified, which is one of the filters we expect to see happen, it's not that hard as more and more data gets posted to draw inferences and actually re-identify. So we need to be very careful about that re-identification risk. The other is when optimizing governance itself, all the different departments and things, it's believed that if you enable more data flows between those entities, they might be able to get their jobs done better, rather than totally siloing things off. So the trick and the hard part there is how do you honor policies, how do you avoid the temptation to reuse data when you weren't allowed to use it previously for one type of use. And I think the biggest nut of those is anything having to do with inter-regime data flows, so cross-border type challenges, because you have 2 separate problems there. One is representing the different policies that these regimes have, and then reconciling how they're different. And that's always been a big issue. And then I'll mention one other, the abuse of services. If more and more things get connected together with technology, there's always opportunities for gaming the system. And so, is the citizen really entitled to the services that they have? Are you counting them properly in a voting process? And finally, big data. There's so much to say about big data. There's a whole panel on it. I'll just mention that I think we need to be investing quite a bit in the ethical modeling. That when we do model, we do it ethically, and how do you do that? And then appropriate application of those models. And then finally, in terms of what are the pieces that we need to resolve a lot of these challenges I just mentioned, one area that I'm spending a lot of time on is new infrastructure for better data management in general. I know that John shares this sort of vision, and there's a lot of work being done by a lot of people in this space. We'll hear more about it. But in general, the idea is that data shouldn't be out there naked. It should actually have the policy and rules that guide it somehow nearby or bound to it in some way. And this is going to increase the confidence that the rules will actually be honored. That will enable more data flows with more confidence, and will even allow the ability to convey the policies from multiple parties in those cross-border scenarios. But we could also add obligations like you're not supposed to re-identify this data. Because if you just simply see this data set, it's all anonymized, you might think, I can use it, it looks pretty clean. But maybe someone already spent a lot of effort to de-identify it, say medical information, other things. And then finally, these things are still great for things like consumer to business and business. They have the same needs. Whatever these governmental optimizations are, those same mechanisms of infrastructure can really help drive greater economy within these other spaces as well.
Great. So I think much of the focus has been on how do you transform business processes within government using data, if I correctly understand, but even a total new way of actually understanding regulation. Can we move to some level of concreteness and really try to reimagine how things would work? So John, can you give us an example, for instance, of if we would now do the data-driven decision-making as you have advocated and worked around, how would the world be different, concretely?
Right.
So and take any example, whether it's in the energy or the example that you've worked with, that you get excited about, an example that says, look, this shows a pointer to where we can go, with then, of course, the understanding that there are a variety of challenges that we need to take care to get there. So what would be an example that you get excited about?
Example. One of the biggest disruptions I think you're going to see comes out of the internet. It's taken a while to happen. It's a whole process of how do you assign an identity to someone, and on the basis of that, how do you get certain privileges? And you think back about a human organization, human civilization, that's been very hierarchical, very fixed, whether it be a lineage system, whether it be a caste system, whether it be the government, a nation state. It's like, okay, once I define who you are, then on the basis of that, you get certain access privileges. I mean, this is fundamental, and this has not changed for thousands of years. I think that whole process is being changed, and let me give you an example of that. In other words, how do you authenticate someone's identity? How do you know they are who they are? Typically, that's been a bank, a state, or church, a family, some kind of kinship relationship, thing like that. Now you'll be able to do that computationally. You can take a mobile phone and you can analyze the data on a mobile phone. I can get a signature that's uniquely me, it's my biometric. And what we're experimenting with is the whole idea of a self-sovereign person. In other words, you can apply an independent algorithm to that data and you can get authenticated. Now the question is what privileges you get. Typically that's been set by the state or various fixed organizations, but you're going to have a lot of experimentation because it's a question of how do you allocate the risk. If someone, and this goes into credit, so how do you do credit scoring? Well, we know that actually the current credit scoring methods are very primitive. You can do credit scoring based upon your behavioral metrics and get a much better score. So people who are unbanked, and this is what we're looking at, how do you take people unbanked and actually do credit scoring, better credit scoring, that on base of mobile phone use? And then how do you enroll them? Well, you may not have to go down to the government to be enrolled. You can be authenticated in a different way, and you can scale that to billions of users. And you can therefore use the metric of risk based upon real analytics, real evidence, real data. So this to me is enormously disruptive, but also freeing because you're opening up lots of services to people and the ability to innovate and compete on how those are delivered.
Great. So we're joined now by with Beth Novak, who was the Deputy Chief Technology, the first Deputy Chief Technology Officer under the Obama administration, worked a lot on open data, is now the founder of the governance laboratory. And so what we've been discussing till now is really meaning how do you reimagine notions of governance as a result of innovations in technology. And so we've had a lot of debate about notions of data-driven innovation, but also notions of identity management and trust systems that allow for new ways of engagement between citizens and governments. So what makes you excited about this field?
Well, I have to say, so thank you very much. And, the promise of data-driven governance, having the data of things like real-time traffic, which should allow you to know that the president is staying at the Hyatt Hotel and that the entire tunnel under 42nd Street is blocked, works in theory, but not based on data alone. If you don't have a driver who actually is checking the data, you end up being late for things. And the point being, to my mind, it's the combination of data with people. It's the combination of, what makes for really smart governance, and this sounds like an echo of some of what's already been said, is the promise of the kinds of big data projects that John and his colleagues work at MIT, these unbelievable streams of data that are coming to us from, whether it's the devices that we carry and the sensors that now permeate our landscape, millions of sensors and cameras, et cetera, that allow us to gather real-time information about conditions on the ground. But it's when you marry that then to the power of people, first, to gather more data and information that we can gather from sensors alone. It's also about the human beings who will report and tweet, whatever you do not take a taxi on the east side of Manhattan today, combined with then the power of people to whether it's to analyze the data, and more importantly, I think to go beyond spotting problems, but to begin to spot solutions. So what I'm excited about when it comes to the future of governance is the combination of this big data-driven future with the power of what we often call open innovation. Sometimes it's called ideation, sometimes it's called brainstorming. It's really the ability to use the intelligence and the expertise of people to come up with the solutions to the problems that we face, informed by data, and sometimes data is part of that solution, but I think it's the technologies that we have for managing work and communication across a distance, for divvying up tasks and roles that allow us to work together in more efficient ways that really holds the promise for the ways that we can come up with solutions to the problems that we face, not only spot the problems better.
Great. Carlos,
Yes.
what's a example that you've come across as a tech-nowist that excites you, that connects the people and the data example that we've been discussing so far, and that would give a pointer to a new vision or a new future of governance?
You know, it's been an incredible evolution on the technological front. One of the things that I think we're all talking about, whether it's the Internet of Things or the Internet of Everything, is this notion that everything will be connected, and everything that's connected will be generating data. And it does bring some very interesting issues on identity, and it brings up very important issues on privacy. And
right.
I mean, one of the things to think about is really, is privacy ever really possible in this hyper-connected world? So, but what I'm excited about is with the ability to have all this data, not only to be able to govern better, I think the whole notion of having data and analytics is to change an outcome or reach an outcome that's desired. And it could be around anything. The best and easiest example that I kind of talk about is, you know, when I went to the doctor, and I'm making this up, is, you know, they do your blood work, you know, you get results from that, and that's just data, right? When you sit with the doctor, they tell you your cholesterol's high, you know, and your blood pressure's borderline, now that's information. Then they sit further and say, here are the things you should do. You should exercise regularly, stay away from these foods. Now that's knowledge. But ultimately, wouldn't it be good, and the example I do is you walk into Whole Foods, as I'm doing my shopping, you know, have an augmented reality layer on my telephone that I can just point to things, and based on my medical record, my exercise file, it gives me recommendations that ultimately help me attain the outcome that I'm desiring. So that's from a personal perspective, and it sounds a little far-fetched. It really isn't. It's just converging, you know, a couple of data streams and doing all those kinds of things. But by doing that, you know, you can apply it to anything. You can apply it to, you know, finding a parking spot. You can apply it to, you know, to reporting something that needs to be done. You can do it for crowdsourcing, ideation, all the things that was already talked about. So my vision is that as we connect more, right, I think it's going to give us the opportunity to really change the outcomes of a lot of things. The question is, you know, how do we deal it in an ethical sort of way, and how do we also deal with it from a privacy perspective, which I think are pushing the limits.
Great. Jeff, do you have a favorite example that you want to share?
Well, actually, I'd like to respond to some of Carlos's points,
sure.
and also highlight something Beth has done in the past. I think there's obviously a call for more efficient government whenever you can do it, or governance, and being able to, you know, somehow get to this untapped set of resources that represents the citizenry. There are clearly experts there that could read on all sorts of things, and you had, I think, cited an example of patents and being able to somehow leverage peers to help push patents through. Part of the challenge of that is knowing someone really is an expert. And, you know, John, you've also done some great work already about how do you intuitively figure out a person is who they say. So part of it is building blocks specifically around verified identity or verified attributes about people to a level of confidence suitable for the transaction at hand, knowing that someone's an expert in an area, that they now have the ability to read on it. So there are mechanisms that are being developed. John, I've spent many years in many meetings with our life force being sucked from our bodies to try to drive standards.
The future of mankind will be will depend
Sorry,
on
I
our-
couldn't help it. I was trying to be realistic.
I was in those meetings.
Exactly. I
Sounds like
think
every
we've all been
meeting.
there. But it's actually encouraging. There is some technologies like anonymous credentials that help bridge the gap between higher confidence and also protecting privacy. It's just that they're tricky to set up, and there's often a missing economic alignment to make them happen. But we're getting closer, and efforts like NSTIC that's been on for a couple of years now might be one mechanism. John also mentioned the word trust frameworks. They're absolutely essential whenever you have these types of claims that you want to depend on, that there's a whole infrastructure there so that you can fall back on non-technical means to make the right things happen, to go after bad actors and so on and so forth.
Great. So I think the key of a new governance vision is to be more collaborative and open. So that's the reason why I actually want to engage the audience already and see whether there are any reactions and comments. I mean, there was a comment made this morning, which I think was very valuable, is that the future of how we're going to govern is going to depend on ultimately the how young generation is going to make sense of the technologies that we have today. Are there any other immediate reactions, questions? There's someone over there.
Hi, I'm from Blue and News, and I actually noticed that you all talked about privacy, and I'm someone from outside the tech world, so coming from politics and world that angle, I'm wondering if the whole Snowden fiasco and how Russia and the US sort of sparred over it brought that to a new light, and how sort of that development in the politics world affected your domains in technology and information.
So I should have probably said any question that does not have to do with Snowden. But it's fine. So here we go. So we have a Snowden question. Let's get over and done with. So who wants to respond to the? Yeah.
I'd be happy
I
to
think
start.
the chief trust architect has probably an opinion about that.
I just came from the EU. I was in Brussels for the EU Data Protection Conference just a couple of days ago, and the tension was very thick. I mean, Julie Brill, who was the FTC commissioner, was there, and she was being hammered on, what's going on with respect to the kind of surveillance. I think, in the context of this panel, I think we were also asked to ask what kind of blocking issues were there that needed attention. And if I had to pick just one, I would pick this whole issue around encryption. And the reason why I would pick it is because it's such a fundamental building block for everything we talked about, that if there's a belief that somehow a backdoor was put in it and the algorithms themselves were actually compromised, now that's just a rumor, and a lot of us here don't even have the data to know whether that's true or not, but just because there's a rumor, there's doubt. And that means that if the United States has the upper hand because they have this magic way of getting into stuff, it creates an unlevel playing field. It affects everything through US-EU free trade, which we also talked about in a number of other sessions after that. So, you'd like to take this off the table because, different governments certainly survey each other. That's not really the core issue in my mind. The core issue is there a fundamental technology that we all depend on that only one player has somehow given themselves an advantage, which then makes everyone else feel uncomfortable, which then tempers all the other things that we try to deal with.
Just briefly, yeah. You want to, John?
Just to add to one point, I think knowing American companies who provide cloud services, they're losing clients. And I think part of this creates a regulatory arbitrage opportunity for other countries to come in and say, we're not going to have backdoors. We're going to have more advanced policies around protecting data and a new government. I think there's a real competition in international governance to get it right. And I think that's going to have a lot of implications. And smaller companies, like countries like Luxembourg, really want to be a leader in that. So I think that it's opened that door and accelerated that process.
I also want to be clear. I just want to make it clear that what I'm saying is it would be great if we could dispel the rumors.
Right.
Because they're rumors at this point. I don't even myself have enough information to know one way or the other. I also know that the way these standards efforts are set up, that there's often 7 or 8 other people all working together, and it would imply a collusion of terrific scale. which I have a hard time reconciling.
Right.
Because I know these processes, and we've been in these meetings. So anyway, I think if we could take that off the table, it would make life a lot easier internationally.
All right, it's off the table. So, yeah.
Hold on that. I'm going to talk about Snowden, don't worry. But the Snowden case show how global companies have to respect different standards. When one national government requests them something, they should do it. They should do what the US was requesting, but create upheld in Germany or in Brazil. And that's the problem companies are facing. My question is the opposite side. I feel we are living in a new time, and Facebook is just a basic idea. How you see the evolution, how these companies can provide services to people around the world. Example of that, Oracle was financed by Sweden to provide a land registration system in Liberia. But Kenya needs the same, and many countries in the south need the same. Can Sweden finance, for instance, with one of your companies, a land registration program around the world, providing this type of services? So can the companies provide services that normally was a public system service, and now it's provided through companies around the world in a homogeneous way, creating a more stable world? That's the question.
So that's an interesting question. So what's the role of social media companies, for instance, like Facebook and others, to actually fulfill certain governance functions that,
Example.
Well, as an example, that's the
primitive
reason-
system.
right.
Go beyond Facebook.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
Facebook
Right.
is basic. They can do much more for land registration. There are many activities. Security probably would be, hospital would be basic activity of state, but there are many others, driver license and many other activities that could be performed by companies.
So that touches on the notion of devolved governance, and perhaps Beth, you may want to reflect on that briefly.
Sure, I'm happy to start, and I think the question plays up the tension between what you may be calling devolved governance or shared governance and what the questioner might be thinking of as privatization. So those are debates we've seen before, particularly in the 80s, about the notion that we could privatize a lot of government functions, whether prisons or schools, and perform them more effectively and more efficiently. I think we've seen that those arguments didn't play themselves out. That's a longer debate, but what's interesting now is the resurgence inherent in your response and the pinpointing of social media is that what we are seeing is, on a case-by-case basis, a lot of functions that we typically think about as government or governance, decision-making, problem-solving functions that are done in new ways by new groups of actors. So I want to pick up on something you said before as a response to this. You talked about the example of going to the doctor and having this conversation and then going to Whole Foods. What you missed in between was you talked about the very traditional model of the doctor talking to you about your health. What you missed is that step of you going on Patients Like Me, you going on, I'm blanking on the names right now of these various participatory medicine sites, where you're going to get much better, much more constant feedback that actually improves your health and well-being from the 20,000 other people who have the condition you have, or the 2,000 people that have the condition you have, and therefore you're going to get better care than you're going to get from that traditional central actor. And it's that advice from others. True story where I said to my doctor, what should I eat after, and he said, you should go on the hot dog diet. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, you can eat hot dogs for all I care all day long, it doesn't make a difference. Whereas obviously we know if you talk to anyone else on the web, they would steer you to the kale aisle in Whole Foods right away. So when we go past your vision, there'll be the prosthetic that just steers you if the groceries don't come to you. The point is that what we're seeing is functions like spending, for example, where now 1,500 different communities around the world are experimenting with participatory budgeting. So citizens are actually doing the work of spending the money, of making the decisions about how does it get spent. We're seeing examples of a company it's a nonprofit company called PulsePoint, which is complementing the work of first responders in 400 different communities in the US. Typically, when you have a heart attack, what happens is the fire department and the police department come to you. Now, PulsePoint has made an app that allows you or me, if we are CPR certified, to receive a notification that someone near us is having a heart attack and to rush to the side of that person and perform bystander CPR. Typically a function thought of as government, being replaced by the combination of a private actor and a network of citizens. So I think the interesting models are going to become somewhere between state and market. It's not simply privatization that's the alternative. It's this world in between that we're still I think it's just beginning to unfold around us of the ways in which networks can powerfully perform the functions of government. But again, what the proper role is of government in setting standards or of industry in collaborating to set standards to help maintain certain levels of security or maintenance of the public interest or otherwise will be very interesting. But let me stop. Devolved governance is the future.
Any other reactions? Or
I'd
before I
like
go
to
to
build
the
on that
next,
point.
yeah.
I think that's going to be a trend. Because I think the innovation, I mean, how do you get these sort of self-sovereign networks in some sense so that they take on responsibilities that traditional institutions have not been able to do? And to go out on a limb a little bit, I think the whole area of currencies and digital currencies, and I mean, Bitcoin is just the beginning, and there's a whole set of derivative companies that are coming in. There's something called Ripple, that if you can design currencies that function that achieve certain collective goals, and you can create algorithms that may be more trustworthy than the central banks, then you're having a major disruption, and where people can express themselves economically and politically in ways they never could before.
Other questions?
I was just so struck by how you asked that question, the person from Bloomberg. But how you asked that question was so interesting. Where are you from? Bluen. I was so struck by how you asked the question, because in the political sphere, it impacts the technology sphere and back and forth. And I was at something where I heard someone talk about the Google self-driving car. And we hear it a lot in the media. But when I heard from the person how he said how if you have a car that can go from point to point, you no longer need car insurance, and you no longer need a car made out of steel because it won't crash anymore. And that struck me how certain things happen across spheres, and we make sense of them. The kind of stuff we're talking about here is so foreign. The tech world. I went to MIT. I understand encryption, but my mom doesn't. So I wonder how we're going to cross all these boundaries of understanding of how complex this stuff really is.
That's a complex question.
So
Yes.
I'd like to just respond a little bit to that. I think in all the things that we've talked about, there's a core capability that needs to be improved, which is usability. And that's true for all the systems that we've been using. So the thing that would temper the success of any of these mechanisms is people's ability to interact with them in a meaningful way, and with a mental model that aligns with what's actually happening. I think the big data space is particularly challenging for regular people because there's this question of at what point should you get people involved in a decision of whether these things get run, and that we talked about a little bit with the ethics. And yet we want to experiment because we really don't know yet all the different little small patterns we're looking for in the big data. We want to try a whole bunch of stuff. Yet at the same time, what obligation do we have to getting users or citizens involved in saying, yes, that's an okay thing to do or not? The ultimate ramifications. So with big data, you got to be really careful when extracting sensitive patterns out of the big data and asking the question, what effects will it have on people? And we've seen examples like of someone saying, hey, you're pregnant. I think Target did that, and basically surprised a bunch of people, and it clearly went beyond what people expected, yet they were able to see the pattern. Mm-hmm. So we have a responsibility, I think, as we move down this path to figuring that out and getting the right loop to happen.
Carlos?
It's interesting. When I opened up my general comments, I said awareness is a really key one. And when I mentioned that, it was really thinking of my generation, the older generation. They're not aware or capable today in many, many ways. And besides the awareness, technology is not that interesting. It's what does it do and how does it change someone's life for the better in some sort of capacity. And the example that I remember is about 5 years ago, my dad was bedridden, and I could never, ever get him on a computer. Never. No matter what. Here I'm a technology guy. We bring in a computer in no. Never used it, never turned it on, had dust. Finally, when he was bedridden, he was bored out of his mind, and he loved to play bridge. So I got him playing bridge on the computer. That was the killer application, was bridge for him. And I remember traveling in Hong Kong and getting phone calls that his internet was down, and he was calling me, how do I get it back up? Because he wanted to play bridge. And I think in a lot of these things is how do we take these big governmental issues, the awareness, how do we translate, make it easier to use? But ultimately, in the end, it's about finding a need that we're fulfilling in a way for a person that interprets it as value. And I think that's where it gets really complicated. And the other thing on the governance issue, we've been talking about big data and privacy and all these other things. The one area that scares the living daylights out of me is synthetic biology.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, where I can, you know, scan a DNA, bring it into a digital format, change the DNA structure, send it back out and print it biological. You know, those are the things that I'm kind of really, you know, where are the ethics there and who's driving it and how we're going to govern that, right? Which is even far crazier than big data.
I just might make one point, and John, there's a presumption that we can understand everything that's going on in our lives. I had an interesting conversation with Danny Hillis, who's at MIT and developed the connection machine. Danny's one of the most creative and inventive people you can imagine. And he said to me, he said, it's all black boxes. He said, I have no idea how this all works. And it's just black boxes and black boxes. And at some point, I think, you know, we're achieving levels of complexity that no one, I don't care who you are, you're not going to know what's in the black box. Therefore, you need to trust other parties that report to what's there. You're really going to depend on the trust of some other party.
Okay.
I was going to add that the blackest box, though, is Washington or Brussels or choose your capital. In other words, the current political systems that we have are designed to be exclusive and exclusionary, which is why John is very smart and went to MIT. I mean, one is we have to ask about what you studied at MIT and how that gets revisited. But the other hope is that as we shift to technology is in the background, but as technology enables us to think about how do we solve problems in new ways, we take these issues which we've thought about as government, which are utterly opaque to most people, and we start to think about them as problem solving. And then I think we begin to crack open things that become accessible to people who have clever ideas all the time, including your bedridden father, you know, playing bridge. I'm sure had lots of great ideas in his spare time sitting there that would solve all kinds of problems in the world. But when we talk about it as government and a set of processes that are exclusive and exclude us from participating on a regular basis, then that's more of a black box than anything.
Question? Yeah.
So I love the bridging the gap thing with the senior generation. But my question is really of unintended governance, and the Google car is a perfect example. I live in Silicon Valley, and I'm married to a former captain in the Air Force, and he decides whenever he sees a self-driving car to race it and cut it off and see if it will stop. And do all sorts of stupid human tricks around it, usually with me in the car. It makes me want to drink in the morning. And the other thing is the policy of it would be really interesting for me to be able to order one of these up and put my children in the car and have them go from school to their after activities. So the question is, I think as we get more black boxian as we go forward rather than less, how do we deal with unintended governance and government? And those types of issues, I mean, does it become more like an organic, having some sort of a sensitive protein on the outside of the data sharing model where there's a kill switch somewhere along the line? Ideas.
Right. So which touches, of course, on some elements that we already discussed. I mean, I think with the self-driving car, I think the big debate right now is, of course, who is liable ultimately when something goes wrong. But same thing if you have, for instance, a self-serving governance system, right, which is being proposed here, then the question is, how comes if you don't have the privileges that you claim to have, how are you going to govern that to a certain extent? And of course, if you go into the area of governance, then you traditionally have notions of due process and how you deal with those challenges. So how do you envision due process in an environment where you have a smarter governance, a more devolved governance to a certain extent? Because again, you can have huge challenges if you start devolving governance functions if something goes wrong, right? And what's the due process that you're going to have there? And I know John has figured it all out. So tell me, so how are you going to solve that?
Well, I'm a little worried of the due process. I think that what you have to have, I mean, recognizing this experiment, recognizing that nothing's going to be perfect. So you're really going to have things that have very explicit audit logs that you can look at, and you can be able to then, and those are open and transparent, and those become part of the feedback loop by which you use it to correct itself. What I try to move away from is sort of a litigation model, that someone says, oh, okay, they make a mistake and they're going to litigate, everyone gets lawyered up, and it goes nuts. You're saying there may be genuine mistakes and the thing can learn and improve upon itself. And so there's some really interesting experiments being done on Elinor Ostrom's notion of a common pool resource and how to manage a commons. And there's some work that we're working with folks who do multi-agent simulation models to see what she has 6 principles and how those principles deal with the problems of unintended consequences, free rider effects, and how do you get feedback loops, and how do you have a generative mechanism creating alternatives. I mean, I think in thinking in that way, and people make different choices about the kind of risks they want to take. So you can opt into a different kind of system, and you can opt out of a different kind of system. But I think we're really early into that process, but I think we can certainly improve what we've got right now. But have the opportunity to do that, and that changes the role of governments to be sort of like principle-based, meta-government, rather than getting into particulars of particular rule sets.
Any bit that you want to?
Agree.
Do you want to agree with that? That's like the most.
Yeah, that's right.
Any? Yeah.
Just to follow on Beth's point, and hopefully I can say this intelligently, if we think about this decentralization of government and civic governance and civic groups local groups getting involved in budgeting, and think about the whole conversation in terms of this revisioning government and technology, is anyone thinking about the fact that you're going to have more data available to people to a larger group of people? Mm-hmm. Who may not be sophisticated in their understanding, but are more sophisticated in understanding how to get information, then doesn't not cause the same problems? You can encrypt what's on the web, but you can't encrypt what's in someone's mind and what they can say to someone else. And sometimes, as we see, not to bring up Snowden again, it doesn't have to be true, but you can give out information that then causes other issues. So what's the thinking around that?
So what's the question?
So the question is, what is it's more of just what's the thinking around it? Are people thinking about that? Are we sort of thinking about government and not thinking about what other challenges may be faced as we revision governance?
Any?
Let me one.
I think so. Yeah.
So I may or may this may or may not be responsive to the core of what's a number of observations that you made, but one thing really stuck out at me in this, and I wanted to come back to that was talked about earlier. Which was this concept of people who may not be very sophisticated and having a lot of information. It comes back to a point you made earlier when you talked about the patent example as well, which is I just want to keep reminding ourselves that we are smart and we are differently smart. And we have a political system right now that's based on the notion of that's based on a value that we hold dear, which is equality. But equality is translated into a set of processes and institutions that are defined by uniformity. We all have to participate in the same way, and it's called voting. Well, that misses an opportunity to recognize that your husband knows whatever it is that he knows about racing cars, driverless cars, not reading maps. I'm thinking about this as the 21st century of not asking directions, is racing the driverless car phenomenon. Or whether it's patents or whether it's privacy or encryption, and someone has passion for schools and another person for the environment. We have different things that we care about and different things that we're good at. And what we don't do yet is tap the differences, the diversity in people's intelligence and expertise to work out new solutions to problems. I mean, we do in other contexts, but it's not typically what we think about as government. And I think as long as we maintain this very slavish adherence to the concept of uniformity, and as long as we have a system in which, frankly, we don't talk about governance or problem solving at all, what we talk about is the blood sport known as politics. Who said what to whom in Washington and who voted for whom, and the Republicans versus the Democrats. And this whole cycle, I think, gets us away from focusing on the fact that we are smart, that we have different kinds of sophistication. Some of it's not certifiable and authenticatable in some of the ways that you talk about. Some of it has to do with, the fact that I might be particularly experienced at doing something but not have a degree in that. There are different ways of measuring this, and you've obviously talked and written a lot about this topic of identity and reputation. But anyway, the thing that really stuck out at me was this point is that we all believe it, is that everybody else out there isn't very smart. That sort of generic Joe Q public, Joe Sixpack, what was his name? The plumber guy? Bob the plumber?
Yeah,
Phil the
Joe
plumber?
the plumber.
Joe the plumber, sorry.
He ran for office.
What?
He ran for office. I think.
I think that's, he might have gotten elected to office, actually.
He's got the qualifications.
You-
It was
Precisely.
certified by...
Precisely my
So-
point is that's what we imagine, and in fact, we have it within our power among us to deal with the problems that we face, including these scary genetic
John, you've been...
thingies.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really
Eager to
great point,
engage.
because we've looked at a sort of an industrialized standardization model of everything has to be uniform, and that's how you can control complex processes, be a hierarchy that's very fixed. And I think the technology, in a sense, has enabled us to deal with highly diverse distributed systems in ways we never could before. And there's huge value in that. And I think, and when I was mentioning the notion of identity and authentication, I say there are other ways, informal or otherwise, you can recognize, discover expertise is out there. And where you see this happening, I think, dramatically, is in the whole software development movement. That with open source software and platforms. I mean, having done software development for 30 years or so, I mean, it's radically changed. And there are people, if you've thought about it, someone's thought about it and done it. And it's a question of discovering where they are, pulling it together, and getting the right APIs. So this idea that there is this widely distributed expertise, the question is discovering it and qualifying it, and then being able to respond to it in a very dynamic, distributed way. And that's what governance is going to be, and not this sort of monolithic model that we have right now.
Carlos, you've been...
I was just going to, the question he had asked, the only thing that came to mind to me was this notion of adopting some of these technologies for a broader, and how do you do it in a very methodical sort of way. And if you look at the history of technology, there's always been two things. There's been accelerators, things that speed it up. For example, in today's day and age, the faster the processor, the more power you have. The more the connections you have, the more powerful the network becomes, or the faster the connections, you're more enabled. And all of them are really powerful. And the inverse of that are all the barriers, right? Infrastructure, every single technology from the telephone to radio to, the internet has all been building upon it. The one that we have to really look at again is now with all of this information, all of this data, all of this revolution that's happening is how do we make it simple? And again, how do we deliver it in a way that's really usable and govern to make sure that it's available to everyone in the right format and capability? And I think that's kind of one of the challenges I think we face.
Okay, so another challenge that I face is that we have 5 more minutes and we have 3 questions. So why don't we take the 3 questions quickly, and then we can go around the platform here and have your final observations that if you may have any. So why don't we start with that? Yeah.
Okay, John Allen. My question is about serendipity. And I listened to a commencement speaker at MIT, and she said, you should think out of the box, black box in Washington, and all the heads nodded yes, yes, yes. And then she paused, and she said, if you do, you'll get fired. And my question is this, if the only people that have access to all of this knowledge or right to vote or anything else have credentials or have perfect credit scores, how do you attract the people who do, or the innovators, or the iconoclasts? How do you allow for them?
Great. Other question was over there. I'm going to take the 3 questions and then, you can seek to answer any of those. Yeah.
Alexandra Maseko, I'm a student at Seton Hall University, and I just wanted to ask more question directed towards global governance. And sort of as the U.S. sort of adopts this more, this involvement of technology in government, how do you see it sort of interacting with other nations that haven't quite caught up? And in that sense, do you think that would leave the U.S. sort of more vulnerable, or will it have some kind of advantage over the other nations as they sort of try to catch up?
Wait, I think perhaps wait for the...
Barry Bloom from the Harvard School of Public Health. You've talked lots about governance of information. You've used medical models, some of which are terrifying to me. Would you talk about governance of misinformation?
All right, so we have misinformation, we have open information, and we have out-of-the-box thinking. So why don't we go around the platform, start with Jeff here, and just reflect on the questions and perhaps make any final observations you might have, because we only have, I think, 4 more minutes.
It's a great smorgasbord of things to think about. I'm going to address that first question around the serendipity, and I'm interpreting it as a call for diversity, strengthen diversity, and innovation. And so I think we have this opportunity clearly that on the web even today, there's huge pockets of domain expertise. I know whether it's cooking or whether it's robotics, I'm likely not only to find people who are really expert in it, who are very passionate, but also 10 videos that show me how to do it. And so much has happened so recently organically just to allow these communities to form. And within those communities, there are norms and reputations are formed. So you don't need the credentials per se. It's just that there is differentiation of who seems to know what they're talking about as a collective understanding, which is a lower bar than I think, a certificate of some kind. In terms of wrapping up my thoughts, I was at this conference just a couple of days ago, and we were talking about big data, which is obviously the thing to talk about. And what struck me is the speaker who came up was so unlike all the other speakers I had heard up until that point. This person was a philosopher and started off with asking these very deep questions. And I found myself realizing just how limited our current processes are for addressing these ethical questions. Like in most companies that are rushing to build models, to build inferences so they know how to personalize experiences, where in their workflow do they do that ethical review and actually try to figure out the implications of what this might mean to a group of people? I mean, even in the government context, if you're doing things like traffic analysis, I think there was a whole group of people that got up in arms because they thought after having analyzed this information, they were going to start handing out tickets to people who had been doing certain kinds of things because they thought the fidelity of the data was high enough it could be done. So we need to be very careful, and I think maturing our processes to catch up with our technology is important. So as a best practice, all companies that do inference modeling have some stages, and someone who's like a philosopher, or someone who can deal with some of the ethics.
Great. John?
I'd like to build on a point that Jeffrey made. I think that, I think the ethical issues are quite important, and that we are in a world where you're collecting an enormous amount of data about people, and you're being able to make predictions and do analytics. And over periods of time, you're being able to shape people's behavior around certain commercial interests. And there are companies now, I won't go with who those companies are, but are collecting sensor data that they can have. You can have a passive, low-powered sensor on your phone, and they can listen to who's talking to whom. They can look, and you don't know what's on. You can't turn it off. They can merge that with other data, and they can use the predictive analytics not only sort of to make offers to you, but shape your behavior to go in a certain direction. And it's all under the control. It's totally black box. It's not transparent. And there's an incentive to architect it that way because of the commercial drivers. They want to have monopolistic control. So you're building social institutions. You're actually building civic institutions of governance that are outside the government. And that's happening at a very fast rate. And do I have confidence in the ability of traditional government mechanisms to provide oversight to that? No. And then we look at other areas and sort of systemic risk that exists, not only some of the security issues, but also financial risk. I believe there are ways of dealing with that. But it requires a fairly sophisticated understanding how technology can be used to provide oversight without creating a mega government. And I think one of the interesting things you find, say, in the Tea Party, they say, well, the reason they don't believe in global warming is that it's a conspiracy to make government bigger because the government's going to tell people what to do. So there's a fear of this sort of monolithic structure being created, but in fact, it doesn't have to be monolithic. You can have distributed controls. So our ways of framing these debates are very impoverished right now.
Carlos, very briefly.
I'm going to try to do a quick round robin. First question was around innovation and how do you attract innovators into government. We're all competing for innovators, so we're trying to get them into our companies too. So you have to offer the right environment and the incentives to be able to get them. Your second question had to do, I believe, with how do other countries leverage innovation and some of the cool things that are happening here, and are we going to be at a disadvantage? What I've seen is there's actually a lot of places around the world that are doing really cool, innovative things that are much more innovative than some of the things we're doing here. So there's a really dispersion. In Songdong in Korea, they're doing a super hyper-connected city, and I can tell you a lot of really interesting things. And last thing, closing comment. We're living in an exponential world, and we've gone from local to global. We've gone from linear now to an exponential. And exponential requires a different approach, requires a different view. I am thrilled that I think we have the opportunity as a collective of mankind over the next 10, 15 years to solve, I think, some of the most complex issues. But I think at the heart of it will be identity things, it will be security, it'll be the governance side of it, and it's really up to us. And I think having that opportunity is a privilege, and I'd rather be alive today and have the opportunity to make those changes than never having it.
Great.
Oh,
Right.
I don't think I can top those interjections, but let me say also on the round robin front that I think what we're hearing a lot of is this notion that we have new forms of institutional arrangements that are possible. So when you get fired from the traditional company or a government that doesn't want you because you're innovative, for every one of those traditional old guard players, there are 3 more that are springing up that are organizing themselves in new ways and new forms with new distributed forms of working. One of those ways we're coming to organize ourselves is often in a global way, global and distributed, as John talked about, with new kinds of power arrangements that don't look like the nation states of old, in specific domains where we're problem solving in a multi-stakeholder distributed fashion. Then one of those big problems that we are constantly going to be solving and is an arms race that we've been in since the beginning of time is against misinformation. I don't think lies and falsehoods and mistruths and gossip is anything new to the internet. It gets accelerated, of course, in these domains, and we constantly have to ask ourselves these questions. But I think the issues that we've come back to about new forms of expertise, new ways in which people, whether it's doers and makers or it's credentialed learners, whether it's those who have 4 PhDs from MIT, or those who simply made a Howcast on YouTube, as we learn, of course, in a certain socialization process that's as much about ethics and about education as it is about technology, how to make sense of the information around us, we empower ourselves and those around us to solve the problems. And I agree with you that we live in an era of tremendous promise and potential to reshape and not only the world around us, but to reshape the institutions and the very fabric of our society. So it's a hopeful time.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
So with that, I would like to thank the panelists who have provided some kind of a common view about a diversity of what is coming. And so we will not have only one box, we will have many black boxes, and it's our task to think out of the box, I guess. So thank you so much.
Thank you.